All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to another monthly webinar here at QLI. I've got Brad Dexter and Anna Calgard here in Studio Q with me as I'm fumbling to take my mask off here so I can actually talk in the microphone. Thanks for joining us today. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the month of September being Spinal Cord Injury Awareness Month, that kind of lines up perfectly with our webinar today. So I've got a few experts in here to give us some information. Brad, I'm going to throw it over to you if you want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself, and then move on to Anna, and then we'll get started here.
Yeah, sounds good. Brad Dexter, been a physical therapist going on almost 11 years now. Have been at QLI for all of my career for that, which has been amazing. And had the privilege to work with a lot of folks that have had spinal cord injury over the length of that time. I've spent most of my time working on our inpatient setting, and here just in the last couple of years have shifted over to our tele-rehab team and have been helping to get that program up and going as well. Which, if you're going to start a tele-rehab program, a pandemic is kind of the thing that helps it start moving too. So if there's a silver lining to it, that has been my one when I talk to people about it. I'm a dad. I'm a husband. I like doing outdoor types of things, hiking, camping.
Humanize yourself a little bit. We want the audience to know more about
there you go. There you go. I've also got Anna Calgard with me this morning. So Anna is another one of our physical therapists and has been working on our inpatient setting here for the last year and a half now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of crazy.
I know. Anna is a dog mom of one, right? And a homeowner, the important things. We should get those out of the way. Anna spent a little time in Texas as a physical therapist before she came up to QLI. So, yeah, I think fun story. She was a student of mine several years ago, and it was just fun to kind of learn about how being at QLI kind of changed your perspective on therapy and how you approach people, how you approach your craft. And so that was fun to learn about when you were going through the process of interviewing here. So yeah. Anything else you want to say about yourself?
No, happy to be here.
We're happy to have you in here as well.
Yeah,
it's exciting. Just a few items before you launch in real quick. Brad, there will be a poll question. So individuals that are looking for your CCM certificate of completion, do make sure that you answer that poll question. That's how we determine who's going to be receiving one of those. And as always, make it conversational. We want this to be a conversation with you guys. We would love to have you here in person. We'd love to be, in a auditorium somewhere talking about this, but being virtual, use the chat function, use the question and answer, and I'll be monitoring those throughout, and then we can get those over to Brad and Anna.
Awesome. So we are talking about acquiring new skills after spinal cord injury, and how do you implement those learning principles throughout a team of people working together. So to Tim's point, we're actually going to start pretty interactive. I want you guys just in the chat, maybe type down what's something that you're currently trying to learn or relearn. And Anna, I'm going to ask the same question of you. So while people are thinking about that and typing into the chat here, what's something that you're currently trying to learn or relearn?
Okay. Yeah. You want me to say now?
Go for it.
Okay. So this is kind of nerdy, but I have been teaching myself how to solve a Rubik's Cube. I saw a guy on a trip. He was a tour guide and he was solving it while giving us a tour. And I was like, that's really cool. So I nerded out and figured out how to solve it. And now I'm working on decreasing my time to solve it.
Are you down to like 3 seconds yet? Because
no.
There are people that
there's a guy that did it under like 1 second.
It's so impressive. No, I think like the best I did was like 2.5 minutes.
That's pretty amazing still.
But yeah, that was a hard skill. I sat down once and maybe was down for like 4 hours, just like learning the configurations.
Yeah, keep at it. Make sure you keep repeating those skills, because I did that a while ago and I forgot how to solve it. So
so the chat, we've got a few. We have Spanish, golf,
nice,
yoga, being around large crowds again, too real.
Yeah,
Cuts
seriously.
Too close to
Seriously.
home. Training for a new role, playing chess, how to be a student again, gardening, speaking French, biking, home remodeling.
Hmm.
Um,
Man, I can relate to that one. I've been learning a lot of DIY things, especially through
for
the
sure.
the pandemic, which is fun. YouTube is phenomenal
Absolutely.
learning resource. So
Someone said how to use a wheelchair or how to be a wheelchair user. 47 years with end stage arthritis, which is decreasing my ability to live my former lifestyle.
wow.
So
So I think, just as you guys kind of get your brains going on things that you're learning, just reflect on the process that you've gone through, the difficulties that you've had, the walls that you've hit, the successes that you've experienced through that, maybe the joy and the frustration that comes along with it, the necessity of maybe needing to come back to skills that you once knew and needing to relearn them again or learn them in a new way as well. So as we jump into presentation, there's 4 objectives that we have. One, we're going to go through 6 components of learning, and we want you guys to be able to take some of those and integrate them maybe into your own lives, but even if you're serving people that have spinal cord injury, being able to incorporate it into whatever service you're providing for them as well. Be able to identify factors that limit new learning and skill retention after spinal cord injury, provide some examples of complex new SCI related routines that can be taught more effectively, and discuss how to best facilitate active engagement in the generation and completion of learning routines. If for whatever reason you are not familiar with QLI and you're joining us for the first time on this webinar series, we are located in Omaha, Nebraska, and we're in the post-hospital realm. So if you've worked with anyone that has had a spinal cord injury, or we serve people that have brain injury and other diagnoses as well, typically they're going through that process of going into the hospital, the acute rehab setting, and then maybe have a decision point after the acute rehab setting where they are going home and getting outpatient, or maybe need further care within an inpatient setting. And so QLI kind of sits within that skilled nursing facility realm. We don't refer to ourselves in that way. It's post-hospital. And we have 60 beds on our rehab campus, serving almost half of that population of spinal cord injury at this point. So mission statement, and I always love coming back to this before starting this presentation too, but deliver life-changing rehabilitation and care, protect dignity, instill purpose, and create hope, commit to excellence. I think as we talk about learning today, it's nice to come back to that, because delivering that life-changing rehab and care is going to come back to how well does this multidisciplinary team know how to teach and coach, and how well do we fall back on learning principles. How do we create hope and instill purpose and protect dignity in the way that we are teaching those skills. And then personally, if we're going to commit to excellence, we've got to know and we've got to refine and hone in on our craft to be able to help other people learn and live a life to their fullest too, right? So it's easy for me, I'll be honest, to just jump into teaching how to learn new skills purely from a physical therapist mindset, and to maybe not humanize it very well. And so I wanted to start just from a place of empathy, right? And so as I was going through this presentation, again, I've given this a few times, I was thinking about me, right? And this is my family. I have 3 kids, wife, right? Kids are 9, 7, 4.5 now. And what would happen if I had a spinal cord injury? How would my life change, right? So I'm a dad, I'm a husband, I'm a physical therapist, I've worked for a great company. I have a lot of what I think of as control over my life, right? I can kind of pick up and go where I want to go when I want to go there. It's easy for me to get myself ready in the morning and be on time for a 7:30 a.m. meeting, right? I coach my kids in their sports and haul them around to different activities. We live in a split level home that we moved to a couple of years ago down the street from friends. And what would it look like if I had a spinal cord injury. How would my life change? How many of those things that I just take for granted on a daily basis would be incredibly frustrating, and maybe would have to like completely relearn how to do things again, right? I've lived in my body for 35 years. I kind of know what it does, how it does things, how it operates. When I don't feel great, I kind of know something's up, right? And I typically know why that might be, typically. But the body is completely different after a spinal cord injury. You have to completely learn how to respond to it and why it's doing what it's doing. And so I just challenge all of us to kind of think about that when it comes to helping people that have had a spinal cord injury acquire or reacquire skills that they may have lost due to their injury. A couple quotes to start out as well. So this one's from Elizabeth Edwards. Resilience is accepting a new reality, even if it's less good than the one you had before. You can fight it. You can do nothing but scream about what you've lost, or you can accept that. You can try to put together something that's good. That's a lot easier said than done. And working with people with that have had spinal cord injuries for a while, they're in lots of different places in terms of grieving. And I think it's just, we'll get into this in a little bit here too, but recognizing where people are at emotionally is a big deal when you're trying to teach them physical skills, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And
sure.
everyone comes from a different background and how they're going to work through some of that as well. This next one is probably one of my new favorite quotes. Ted Lasso, if anyone has been watching Ted Lasso, great show, putting a plug in for it right now.
It is a great show.
But so Ted Lasso, if you don't know who it is, it's a character played by Jason Sudeikis, who used to be on Saturday Night Live and has been in a number of other things too. But he plays a soccer coach, a football coach in America turned soccer coach for a Premier League team in Great Britain. And so one thing he says is taking on a challenge is like riding a horse. If you're comfortable while you're doing it, you're probably doing it wrong. And so we'll jump into the nature of that quote here shortly. All right, so I wanted to start off just talking through learning principles. We have talked about learning for a long time at QLI. It's something that is just really ingrained into the fabric of our culture. It's important from a growth standpoint for our employees, and it's also really important from just a delivering services standpoint, therapy-wise. It's not just our physical therapists or our psychologists or our speech therapists that need to know about this. We're working this into the fabric of our entire culture, down to our folks that work in housekeeping, our folks that are spending a lot of time with people within a residential setting. We call them rehab trainers. You would know them as CNAs, right? There's a reason we call them rehab trainers. They're doing a lot of hands-on, and they need to be very skilled in the way that they help to train as well. And so it's really important that we work side by side with everyone on the team. PTs are working side by side with our rehab trainers. Our OTs are doing the same, working in the house settings. And so those learning principles have evolved over time, especially as new literature has come out, as we've understood the brain more and more. And we have, in the last several years, we've been incorporating in what we would call learning mantras and learning principles. And so we're actually going to go through some of those to begin with. And I'm going to say them out loud, and then we'll actually dive in a little bit deeper, and then we'll start to apply those in practice to individuals that have had spinal cord injuries. So the six principles that we typically talk about are: identify the interferences, motivate with meaning, tie it to the task, support for success, just outside your comfort zone, and repeat, repeat, repeat. So we had a group of people that really kind of like got those into what we say mantras, right? To make sure that it's easy to remember them, and then that you can take any amount of them and you can kind of apply them to a situation with maybe one of the people that we're serving on our campus. So Anna, do you want to talk a little bit about identifying the interferences? What does that mean?
Yeah, I think it's such a pivotal thing. And I think it's something that we miss a lot of times initially as clinicians. And so it's something that I personally have been really trying to dive into, really like kind of the first touch point that I'm having with a person. And so you can read it. It's identifying those physical, emotional, environmental, or psychosocial interferences that are really preventing this person from acquiring skills. And you think about someone with a spinal cord injury, gosh, like they have so many interferences going on. I mean, you just think about the medications that they're on that are clouding some of their cognition, and they're tired from some of these medications. They have tons of family stress, financial stress. They're thinking about, like you said, like, how am I going to be a dad again? How am I going to be able to coach my kids? Hey, I have to modify my home, get a new vehicle. Like, there's just so many elements that I think if we're not addressing them early on, or at least like helping them work through these things, then they're never going to be able to acquire these skills that we're trying to teach them.
Yeah, that's great. So a few things that I want to touch on from that is just what do we know about cognition and learning after a spinal cord injury? So there have actually been some studies that have been done on rodents that show chronic inflammation to the thalamus, the hippocampus, and the cortex with like neurodegeneration and cognitive decline. It's harder for them to have spatial and retention memory. They have more impairment in those areas, and even have shown depressive like behaviors. And so there's something from inducing that spinal cord injury within those laboratory settings, that because the spinal cord is attached to some of those higher levels of thinking, there's this inflammatory process that occurs and actually changes the ability to learn in some way, shape, or form. We've, just anecdotally, you mentioned some of the areas that people will kind of wrestle with after a spinal cord injury, the number of medications that they might be on, processing through everything that has changed, and trying to make sense of that, and even just trying to figure out a way forward. So the grief that's kind of happening real time, and going through that at times, due to the nature of the accident itself, there may be some form of like a brain injury, mild brain injury, or even a more severe traumatic brain injury that occurred that can affect the individual's ability to store memory and remember how to do things, right? Layer in the amount of fatigue that they might have, right? So there's a lot of talk about sleep hygiene, and sleep disturbances that happen, especially within a hospital setting early on. Lots of people coming in and out overnight. There's lots of machines and equipment that are beeping, ambient noises, those types of things that can cause problems with sleep, autonomic dysfunction, depression, anxiety, pain. You hit on a key one, the polypharmacy part. So the number of medications, right? So oftentimes we have people that maybe are dealing with pain early on, and what do they take for pain?
Yeah, they're on oxycodone. They're on a lot of those narcotic medications that like just really cause drowsiness, mental fog, all those things.
Absolutely. And so those are normally prescribed for some of the musculoskeletal types of pain, especially post-surgery. The bony changes that happened, from spinal fixations, fusings, those types of things, right? And then neuropathic pain medications. Those can also alter one's ability to think a little bit more clearly as well. And so, and then you layer on any number of other
spasticity medications. Yeah, there's just so many elements.
I mean, we typically have a long list of medications that people are coming to us with, even at a post-hospital setting, right? There can be challenges to new motor learning. So I just think about, some of the things that you guys said in terms of yoga or learning how to do different projects around your home. There's very much motor learning that happens, and you're figuring out how to use your body in a different way. The Rubik's Cube, right? You're kind of figuring out how to turn, especially if you're trying to drop your time down on the Rubik's Cube,
Right.
how to turn it quickly, which fingers to use. And so there's a motor skill that happens there that with repetition, you start to speed up. Well, with a spinal cord injury, take away muscle groups that you might be used to using, and all of a sudden you're trying to figure out how to balance yourself just by using your arms, or how to move yourself only by using your arms, how to propel a wheelchair without having any amount of grip in your hands, right? And it's a can be a completely backwards way of learning things, right? Our occupational therapists work on skills with some of our cervical level spinal cord injuries on how to extend their wrist to get some amount of grip, right? Well, that's not how you have been gripping things for the entirety of your life. And now it's completely different. And you have to relearn how to do that, right? And then layer that on with just the high volume of new learning within a short rehab stay. So majority of you, when you answered that question earlier, probably just listed one thing, right? Because one new thing can be pretty overwhelming to us. We have a lot going on in our lives, and you add in one new task that we need to learn, and we tell ourselves, okay, I need to set aside time to kind of focus on this one thing and get away from everything else, right? We have folks coming to us, their lives have been flipped upside down. They have all these other things going on, and we have a high volume of new skills that we're trying to teach them, and wanting them to learn those skills within a short period of time, right?
Absolutely.
And then take
Yeah.
them and apply them to real world. I'm assuming you've seen that.
Oh, yeah.
Upfront,
Every
right?
day. Yeah.
Every day. How do people respond to that?
I think it's a mixture of, I mean, we're coming in, there's some highly motivated people coming in. Their full commitment is to regaining these skills, but it can be really overwhelming. Sometimes they don't even know initially all that they need to learn, and then you're kind of bombarding them, and it can be very overwhelming. A little bit depressing sometimes, like, gosh, I just regained the skill and now you want 5 other things that I need to acquire to learn again. And so, yeah, I mean, it's hard.
So, I mean, just to like throw this out there, what are some of the new skills that we're typically teaching people?
So, I mean, from a PT standpoint, transfer training, gait training, those are requiring being able to propel a wheelchair, are big things that I'm hitting on. I think about from like the OT standpoint, they're learning how to get dressed again, how to get out of bed, how to complete a bowel program, or to empty their catheter bag or self-cath themselves. Even how can they prepare a meal? How can they open a door? How do they access their community again? I think fortunately people have been able to get off campus a little bit more, which has been nice to be able to see, like, process, how do I get into a restaurant and order, get my wallet out, pay for these items. So there's a lot of different elements kind of spanning their therapy day that we're addressing.
Yeah. One thing that I've done in the past when I'm giving this, especially in person places, I'll take a show of hands of, who works in the acute care setting, how about inpatient rehab, what about outpatient? And I think it's healthy to just acknowledge that the skill training that happens at each one of those levels is slightly different, right? There are things that are urgent to learn really, really quickly, and then things that are kind of important within different settings. And if I were a therapist on the acute care side of things, I can't expect the person to learn all the skills that they need within such a short period of time, right? And physically, they're probably not ready for some of that. Right. So if you have someone that's still in a cervical collar, they may have lifting restrictions, and there may be a lot of deconditioning that comes along with that early on within the recovery process. And what they're able to do in the acute care setting is going to be different than maybe what they can do later in an inpatient rehab stay or in an outpatient therapy setting. Within our realm, post-hospital, you hit on a lot of these already. One thing I want to point out is the skin checks and taking care of your skin. So I know that's such a mind-blowing thing for a lot of folks. And typically we're getting people like 2 to 3 months after their spinal cord injury at QLI. And I know some great therapists that have been drilling skin checks into some of our folks. And it's still just a hard concept. Like, I used to be able to feel when I needed to move, but now I have to like think about the fact that every 20 to 30 minutes I need to shift my body weight or tilt back my chair or lean forward in my chair for a few minutes to make sure that I am taking care of my skin, right?
Yeah.
Or I can't just crawl into bed and you know, turn myself when I need to overnight. There's all of these other factors that I need to think about. Blood pressure monitoring, administering their own medications and knowing what they are. We already talked about the long list of medications. So, gosh, such a steep learning curve. And again, just coming back to what we talked about earlier from an empathy standpoint, we certainly have a responsibility to drill this stuff into folks, but there's a place for empathy while we're doing it as well. One thing that's on this list, the assistive technology use, I think that used to be more of an interference than it has been. But because a lot of assistive technology has been built into the mainstream for you and I as consumers too, it's just a lot more natural to be able to pull out your iPhone or your iPad and be able to tap on the screen to type things, or even voice to text types of things are more normal these days than they used to be as well. Yeah. So all of these were listed under identifying the interferences because there's a lot of interferences that come with learning the new skills. So support for success is another one of our learning mantras. Anna, do you want to talk about support for success a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's such an important concept from every player that you think about. It's not just the physical therapist or the occupational therapist, but it's really like, how are we pulling together these people or even environment to really help someone with motor planning, neuroplasticity, motor learning? How are we integrating the family members into acquiring these new skills? Are we setting up their environment for them to be successful? If I have someone who's trying to be independent with getting out of bed, we need to make sure that their chair is in a place, that everything's in place for them so that they can be as independent as possible with that. And so, and then just thinking about some of those higher level things, like, is this someone who is really just still dealing with a lot of anxiety and depression and just isn't really there to be able to acquire the skill? How are we supporting them in that as well?
So when you think about like providing some of that support, like I'm thinking about like a physical task, maybe like you're retraining someone how to walk again after they've had an incomplete cervical spinal cord injury. How do you determine the right amount of support to give?
Yeah, I think it's kind of dependent on kind of my abilities to assist in that gait planning. I mean, what type of assistive device do we need? Are they requiring some amount of technology? Are we using robotics or body weight support initially because they just can't? They just don't have the strength yet. And then what is that verbal feedback I'm giving them? What is that tactile feedback I'm giving them? There's a lot of different elements that I can either play up or play down. If someone is relearning a skill and I'm bombarding them with tons of verbal, tactile, there's a lot of distracting environment going on, that's going to be really hard for them to learn. And so I'm thinking about all those elements when we're learning how to walk again.
Okay. So in other words, like if you are working on the Rubik's Cube and you had someone looking over your shoulder, like screaming left, right, up, down, left, right, that'd be really like confusing.
Oh, yeah.
It wouldn't help the learning process for
Probably
you.
not.
Okay. So a few things I want to just think about when it comes to support for success. One, we're really looking at creating new habits for people, new routines, right? And you have this concept of a habit loop where there's some kind of a cue that's given, there's a routine established, and there's a reward from that. And then you can refine that cue, you can change it, or you may be able to kind of, how'd you say it, play it up or something like that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So you may slightly change that cue to alter the routine, and in the case of walking, the reward would be, hey, I went faster, or I went for a longer distance or a longer duration of time when I was walking, or I saw my step length improve, those types of things. So, and a lot of that is coming back to the fact that as we're providing the support as we're going through a lot of these learning principles. We're looking to actually physically change the brain, right? Neuroplasticity. The brain's going to reorganize itself by forming some of those new connections, and the routines that we're establishing from that habit loop and how we're providing that support can turn positive or it can turn negative, right? It's easy to fall into a bad routine if you're not intentional about it. And it sometimes can be harder to change that bad routine once it's established too. So one of the things I heard you even hitting on was some of the different learning styles. So I think that's part of support for success, right? Is understanding who is this person, how do they tick, when do they need some of the feedback that they need. So I'm curious, like, how do you decide if you're teaching a slide board transfer, if you're teaching wheelchair training skills to someone, are you giving a lot of feedback like back to back to back? Do you wait until they complete the task? What does that typically look like?
I think it's so dependent on the person and maybe even like their personality and kind of back to like kind of their learning style. I have some people who are young athletes or former athletes and really benefit from like kind of this like kind of hard pushing. They want to be pushed really hard. Other people that would be an interference for them because they don't like being kind of pushed to that level or getting a lot of verbal feedback. I even just think about initially, I'm probably giving a little bit more support when they're learning a skill. So I have someone who's learning how to do a slide board transfer. I'm giving a lot of kind of verbal and tactile feedback initially and giving them some support. But as we're regaining that skill, I'm trying to pull back from that. So maybe initially I'm giving a lot of cueing kind of consistently, but as they're requiring the skill, I'm trying to pull back and give them some time to kind of learn from those mistakes a little bit even. I know we kind of get to that later, but just how do we learn? Can we learn from consequences and mistakes?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good segue too, because we talked earlier about maybe one of the interferences that could happen is that there's a brain injury on top of the spinal cord injury. Excuse me. And so memory is going to be one of those main factors in the learning process, and that's going to influence some of the teaching approach that you would use as well, right? And so, one way to give people support would be even thinking about like, how do I give explicit cues versus implicit cues, right? And there's a difference between explicit and implicit learning. We take memory and kind of reason through those things to learn explicitly, right? So you guys listening to this webinar right now are hopefully learning some things explicitly. You're taking in some of the information, you're processing through it and reasoning, and maybe you'll have some kind of application point. There's an element to, Anna talking about learning how to do the Rubik's Cube where there's explicit learning that's maybe happening up front where you have to learn all the steps.
Yep.
But then the more that you do that, the activity plus repetition, it's going to become more implicit learning. And if we have, one, we can recognize that maybe from a learning style standpoint, the right support for a person may be to help them learn something implicitly. So we've talked about the fact that after a spinal cord injury, there's a plethora of new skills to learn. So we can talk explicitly to some people and take them through every single step and expect that they maybe reason through it and then come to a conclusion, process it and spit it back out for us. But it's probably going to be a little bit easier to take an approach of implicitly teaching them some of those skills, especially if they have no memory impairments, right? We teach them some of those skills and then come back a little later to explain the reasoning as to why behind it, right?
Yeah,
you're not going to take a person through every single step and explain what muscles they're using when you're teaching a slide board transfer, right?
No.
That
would not be helpful.
So even just thinking about like the level of impairment that they may have with their memory, This is a diagram showing explicit versus implicit learning. So, memory plus reasoning is the explicit, activity plus repetition is the implicit. And so if you have even some kind of mild impairment, that could be polypharmacy, that could be grief, depression, anxiety, anything that's impacting learning in this case, you can see the implicit side of things kind of blows up a little bit more. So we maybe want to put more and more focus on that implicit to give them the right amount of support for success. Okay. Motivate with meaning. Can you talk about how you use motivate with meaning within your therapy?
Yeah, so I think this is the pivotal thing where you have to kind of understand your patient. I could tell them that, hey, I really want you to learn how to do stairs again, but they're like, I don't have stairs in my home. I don't really need to access stairs throughout my life. Maybe that's not important to them. Or someone who wants to be a soccer coach again. How are we teaching them how to propel their chair over grass or those types of things? Because that's really important. I have to get it down to the field to be able to coach my son in soccer. And so it's really identifying those things that are really motivating to that person, because that's what they're going to learn the best if they have the motivation.
Just another audience engagement point. If you guys have worked with someone that's had a spinal cord injury, can you maybe just drop in the chat some things that you've seen from a motivate with meaning aspect that has really driven maybe people to take off with some of their therapy or life skills that they're learning? That'd be awesome. We'll share some of those here shortly. So Anna, we've also talked about the importance of integrating a lot of these learning principles throughout the entire culture of our company, whether you're working in housekeeping or in accounting or within the residential setting, or you're providing therapy services to people. So how do you, as a therapist working within the midst of a larger team, how do you guys motivate with meaning and kind of integrate that throughout the entire team?
Yeah, I think it's one, information sharing. I think you have to get that information out to the team. Are you kind of specifically to like other team members learning? I think you have to get them excited about it and kind of give them the why behind it. If you're telling me that I need to learn this new skill, but I don't know why, or I don't really see the purpose, then I'm not going to be very motivated to learn that new skill. So I know initially we're really pulling in those rehab trainers that you were talking about to different skills, teaching someone how to complete a slide board transfer and being safe with that. Like that's a really important skill, but if they can't put a person that they're caring for into that place and know why it's important, then they're not going to be motivated.
That's such a great point. I mean, there have been so many times where it may be something like medication management. Why do they have to learn, what all of their pills are and what times they're taking them? Why is that important? Why can't someone else just do that for them? Well, that's a person that actually is going to be responsible for getting their kids out to school early in the morning. And so they've got to kind of be on top of things. Obviously, if your medications don't come in at the right time, it can affect other things with your body and the way that it operates throughout the rest of the day. And so what a great example of just like digging into who is this person, what makes them tick, and then kind of tying the medication or whatever other skill it is into what their life is going to look like, what they've communicated to the rest of their team. That's a really, really great example. All right, Tim.
Yeah,
what do we got?
Some of the interactions you had here. So someone said accessing the community. We have someone who commented just about how the QLI team actually helped someone access the community again, and that was the motivation. Being able to hold a bottle for a newborn son, navigating terrain, to be able to hunt, being able to access an airplane again, transfer safely to a seat on an airplane so they could go see a family member's new home. Let's see here, just caring for their family members. Someone talked about the ability for a vehicle to be modified was actually a motivator to want to be able to access the community again. So like there were some modifications that were able to be done to a vehicle, which that was the motivator. So how do we transfer into that safely? All of those things. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thanks, guys. Thanks for putting those in the chat. So our next one is tie it to the task. So it's going to integrate a little bit with motivate with meaning, right?
Absolutely.
But do you want to talk about tie it to the task?
Yeah, I think of a patient example when I specifically think of this. I have a woman right now who is about to discharge on Friday, actually, and she is trying to learn how to go up and down stairs again. But at her home, she doesn't have a railing on her stairs. It's a pretty narrow, and it's kind of goes up, loops around, and comes up. And so initially, we're practicing just the skill of getting up the stairs. But if I'm having her just march in place, that's not specific to the task itself. I think it's important to identify those muscles that need to be strengthened to be able to complete that task. But really what's going to be the most motivating to that person and the most specific to that task is actually doing that task. But back kind of to what her home environment is, it wouldn't really make sense for me to train her on doing it with a railing because she's not going to have that at home. And so how am I making it task specific to what she will need at home? So we're working on her holding onto a wall and a quad cane to be able to get up and down the stairs, because that's more task specific to what she's going to have to do.
Fantastic.
That's awesome.
Just outside your comfort zone. This is back to the Ted Lasso quote, right?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, being a former soccer player, this like really resonates home. Just kind of like when you're doing suicides on a field, and it's just like just to that brink of like just pure failure. And so I use the example to someone of like a cliff. So I want you to get really close to that cliff. So really pushing yourself, but not to the point of failure. So I want them to, this should be challenging. This shouldn't be easy. If it's too easy, then we're not acquiring any new skills. We need to progress. But if we're getting to the point of failure, kind of back to that implicit learning, if they have failure after failure after failure, then we're not getting that implicit learning. And especially if they have all these interferences in cognitive impairment that they can't learn explicitly from those consequences, then I don't want them constantly failing at the task.
Yeah. So, I mean, coming back to tie it to the task, right? When we think about tie it to the task, there's maybe a big picture end goal. And you guys, when we asked the question about motivate with meaning, you maybe even gave some examples of like being able to travel, getting on an airplane or an accessible vehicle, right? We as the team, we'd have to kind of like break that large scale task into smaller achievable tasks. But in order to go through that progression to reach the ultimate goal, we have to get outside of the comfort zone, just outside of the comfort zone, to actually progress to the next part of that task.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking like manual wheelchair skills. If you're teaching someone how to
go up and down a curb,
that's a great example for someone that's maybe low thoracic, lumbar level spinal cord injury, right? How would you teach something like that? How would you get them just outside of their comfort zone? I mean, I'd be outside of my comfort zone just thinking about the curb.
Same. So. Yeah. So I think initially I'm maybe not doing it on the curb. Maybe I'm having like a small mat that's 1.5 inches thick. Okay. And we're just working on the skill of getting up and down from that pretty safe environment. I'm there obviously behind them to prevent any falling. As they're acquiring these new skills, and it's getting easier for them, I want to keep progressing that height of that lip that they're trying to get up, and then eventually really working towards the curb, back to that kind of that task specific. But we don't want them obviously to the point that they're failing, to the point like they could be tipping backwards, but
right, there's a safety aspect.
There's a safety aspect. Yeah. But this should be something that they maybe feel that kind of that tension or like a little bit uncomfortable during it. This is something that it's a complex skill, so that's normal, but that's, I think, so imperative for the motor learning.
Yeah, this is one that I, working within a tele-rehab environment now, I don't have my hands directly on people, but there's a lot that I'm thinking about and analyzing as I see it or as I hear them talk about things, right? And I have a couple clients in particular that we've just talked a lot about this concept, because they're in their home, and this is outpatient therapy that I'm providing through tele-rehab. And in order for them to actually progress the skills that we're discussing together, I've got to get them to change habits that are really ingrained and have been ingrained for a long time. And so we talk about this concept of, I got to get you outside of your comfort zone. I know what we're doing right now is a little bit harder than what you typically do, but I've got to kind of push you outside of where you're comfortable, and we got to live in this uncomfortable space without, as you put it, falling off the edge of the cliff to failure, right? And that learning is going to happen within that area just outside of the comfort zone. It's good. And then this is, I mean, it's probably our favorite word is PTs, right? Like repeat, just do it over and over and over, repetition. So we were talking earlier about support for success, and where, you know, implicit learning, the activity plus the repetition helps to drive some of that learning, right? And here's the repetition part. So obviously, you know, going back to the terminology we were just using with, you know, breaking down the task and pushing people just outside their comfort zone, you know, they have to get outside their comfort zone, but then they have to live there and get a lot of repetition too.
Absolutely. Right? Yeah. If someone's learning how to do a new transfer and they're only doing it 5 times in a PT session, that's not acquiring that skill. I mean, I think really being at QLI, we have an environment that lends to that. You mentioned again the rehab trainers, so utilizing all these different players at our company to really get that repetition and drive that repetition is so important. I'm sure just within Tela as well, there's ways that you're creating their schedule so that they're getting high repetition of a skill that they're trying to acquire.
Yeah, absolutely. So
well, I was going to say too, I think just an observation, you know, you mentioned the environment. I think just our campus in and of itself, you know, lends itself to repeat, right? And even for Tela, right? They're in their own home. So you're having them do all those things in their own environment. So just removing the hospital setting and the ability for them to really, you know, do activities that are going to, you know, real world activities for their, you know, after discharge.
So, and to that point too, you know, I think this is, we've talked a lot about just internally and about our clients as well, but I think one other area that we need to consider, or at least talk about openly here, are caregivers or family member support system that will be around the folks that we're serving too. And I think we're doing okay at like teaching caregivers and family, but it's always an area that we can certainly improve into, especially when you have the challenges of a pandemic and doing that. I think that's something that we've really missed around here in some of the transitional aspects that we love doing, whether it's taking people home and or getting families on campus. Like that's been a challenge during the pandemic, right? Getting better, but
it's getting better.
Yeah. And honestly, they have to go through a similar process of learning some of those skills and understanding why is that important? Why,
that's a good point.
Why do they need to do that? Why is the repetition then key? And how do we build that more naturally into their day? So that is the presentation. One thing I kind of want to end on here is, you know, we talked very early on in the presentation about the fact that you know, there's a lot of skills to take on, and oftentimes we're expecting people to figure those things out in a very short period of time. You know, if any of you have been in healthcare for, you know, over 20 years that are listening to this, you've seen length of stay decrease rapidly. You've seen payments and funding change for individuals that have had spinal cord injuries. And it's a challenge to try to help them learn all of the skills that they need to have, whether that's them accomplishing them independently or being able to direct a caregiver on how to complete things for them. And so, you know, I'm just acknowledging that we have a really important job in making sure that we educate well, we teach well, and we help people learn, because the ultimate goal is that they have ownership over those skills, and their success moving forward is reliance on that. And so for those of you listening, that's also something to be looking for when you're maybe considering rehab for people, that if you're managing their case, or it's a family member, a loved one of some kind, pay attention to how the teams working with the individuals you're serving are coaching and teaching and approaching that learning perspective, because it takes time to pick up on those skills. Certainly takes a high level of empathy, and it takes a good coaches across the board to make that happen. So I know Tim just popped up the poll question. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I did. So as mentioned earlier, if you are looking to receive a certificate of completion, please answer the SCI or the SCI poll that just popped up on your screen. Also, if you just want to answer it, please do. I think Brad may talk a little bit about the answer here. Wide range of answers coming across. So
yeah, well, I purposefully, didn't put in like a specific level of injury here, because there, and I could have put in an it depends answer, and I think there would be a vast majority of people that would have selected that option. But yeah, it really does depend. If you're looking at maybe an individual that has a lower thoracic or lumbar level injury, there's a lot of skills that they perhaps can pick up on and do relatively quickly, maybe in that 3 month to 6 month post injury range. But the more complexity there is to an injury, typically, moving up the spinal cord. So when you get into lower cervical spine or higher cervical spine types of spinal cord injuries, that's where there's a lot higher complexity of skills that maybe need to be learned to either direct someone through caring for them or doing some of that on their own, right?
You mentioned earlier, Brad, just length of stays. And do you have numbers? What's the average length of stay in an acute rehab setting when they're in the hospital? After ICU, they go to an acute rehab setting. Do you kind of have average?
I have another presentation that takes those numbers off of the University of Alabama, Birmingham, puts out spinal cord injury facts and figures usually every January.
Okay.
So I have another presentation that has those numbers in there, but I would just be spitballing if I said them right now. What I can tell you is that in the last 30 years, the length of time in acute rehab has gone down, and the total amount of time that people get in rehab has gone down drastically. And what you see is those folks are ending up going to outpatient therapy services a lot sooner than they used to, right? So, but I'll throw that reference out there for people. University of Alabama, Birmingham, facts and figures, SCI facts and figures. If you guys Google that, it does have those numbers on there.
Okay. And then we did have one question just come through of what you touched on this briefly, but what role do family members play in learning new tasks? So you can just talk briefly about where they fit into the continuum or to the puzzle of new tasks.
Yeah, well, I'm going to say it depends, right? It depends on the type of injury. Obviously, so there are even just relational dynamics, because we may work with people that, maybe a husband says, I don't want my wife to have to care for some of these just personal things. I want her to be my wife and not necessarily my caregiver. Now, depending on the level of injury, that may be more or less feasible, right? So if you have a higher level injury in your cervical spine, and there's a very real reality that maybe caregivers don't show up one day, it's going to be important that maybe your spouse or another loved one has some of those same caregiving skills. However, if that person maybe is a lower level thoracic or lumbar level injury, it may be very feasible that they can just do the majority of those skills on their own and not need to rely on a spouse to help care for them in that way. So
absolutely. Do you have your contact information at all on this slide?
I sure do on the next one.
Just in case anyone has any other questions for you, whether it's our inpatient program or tele-related, feel free to reach directly out to Brad. Maybe I'm going to pull here. And Anna.
And me?
Yeah, myself or Anna. Both of us are up there.
Any questions about the presentation, anything, just feel free to reach out to them or to just the QLI webinars at qliomaha.com, and we can always direct appropriate questions to both of them too. So yeah, I think that's it. Thank you both. Appreciate your time.